In this panel, we have three presenters. And in order, the presenters are Jake Sherman, Matt Segal, and Joshua Rami. And so I will first be introducing Jake to you. I don't think he needs much of an introduction here, but for those who don't know him, Jake Sherman is Chair of Philosophy, Cosmology and Consciousness at CIIS. He received his PhD in Philosophical Theology from the University of Cambridge, taught previously at King's College London, and from 2014 to 17 held a visiting appointment at the as a university lecturer in philosophy of religion at the University of Cambridge. By training a philosopher, theologian, and religious studies scholar, he is the author of Partakers of the Divine, Contemplation and the Practice of Philosophy, an editor with Jorge Ferrer of the Participatory Turn, Spirituality, Mysticism, Religious Studies. The author of over 24 articles, essays, and reviews, his writings have appeared in publications such as the Journal of American Academy of Religion, Modern Theology, and the International Journal of Philosophy and Theology. He is currently working on a new manuscript entitled The Book of Nature, Theology, Natural Philosophy, and the Ecological Imagination. And Jake is going to talk to us about pedagogy and the coming trauma of materialism, moving beyond 68 with Owen Barfiled and Augusto del Noce. Jake.
Okay, good morning, everyone. For my part, this morning, I had trouble sort of exactly knowing how to address these questions in light of 68. So I thought what I'd do is I'd go back and think about some figures who were writing at that time who have been challenging to my own thought and to my own pedagogical practices. So I wanted to look at two extraordinary but regularly overlooked figures of the 1960s. The Italian philosopher and political theorist Augusto del Noce, and the literary critic, philosopher, and anthroposophist and Inkling, Owen Barfield. Both figures defy easy categorization in terms of either left or right, in part because they think that the sort of horizon against which left and right are defined is precisely the horizon that they're interested in taking apart and moving beyond. Nevertheless, if you wanted to sort of think of them that way, you kind of think of Owen Barfield leaning a little bit more towards the left, with his interlocutors in the 60s, especially being people like Norman O. Brown, or Thomas J.J. Althusser, or Marshall McLuhan, while Del Noce swings a little bit more towards the right, with his critique of totalitarianism coming largely from the kind of communio wing of Roman Catholicism. Okay, so already in the late 60s, Barfield and Del Noce diagnosed in their own day a kind of bourgeois transformation of both positivistic and historical materialism into what they discerned as a new reign of technology. Del Noce called it the affluent society, and Barfield refers to it simply as alienation, a society in which interiority is largely effaced, philosophy subjects itself to technology, and culture to politics. Both thinkers developed their response to this in part for reflecting on the student movements of the 1960s, in which they discerned a resistance to this affluent society, but a resistance that could not succeed without radical pedagogical attention not only to extant structures of oppression, but also, and even more, to the historical and metaphysical roots of modern alienation. So let me begin with some words about Owen Barfield, for those of you who don't know his work. Although he spent the bulk of his adulthood working as a London solicitor in the mid to late 1960s and then on into the 1970s, Owen Barfield enjoyed a series of visiting appointments in universities across North America. Drew, Brandeis, SUNY, the universities of British Columbia, Victoria, and elsewhere. He spent the spring of '68, for example, as a visiting professor of philosophy at Hamilton College. And he made a number of journeys throughout the '60s and '70s to speak on American college campuses, including just across the bay. He spoke at Cal, he spoke at UC Santa Cruz. In fact, during these visits, Barfield often found the students far more receptive to his thinking than the faculty. During the height of the student protests in Berkeley, when the students had effectively sort of taken charge of curricular offerings, they forced an offering for credit in Barfield studies that ran for one semester. It was shut down after that. But now, while nearly all of Barfield's writings yield rich returns when studied, his most timely treatment of the 1960s is probably his essay titled The Coming Trauma of Materialism. If you've read any Barfield, you'll recognize a number of key themes here. He's concerned with the demythologization of nature and rampant attempts to reduce everything about everything to a combinatorial story in which anything real must be understood in terms of elementary particles and fundamental physical forces, both of which can be described mathematically and formally rather than poetically and qualitatively. In The Coming Trauma, Barfield takes as his starting point the work of the historian Theodore Rossack, who's most famous for naming and chronicling the making of the counterculture. Following and expanding upon Rossack's subsequent work, Barfield is interested in a deepening critique, not just of extant power structures and our ruthlessly technological societies, but rather in a critique of what he calls the historical and metaphysical roots from which these structures spring. At the heart of this is Barfield's critique of what he calls alienation, the psychological, cultural, political, and imaginative situation in which we find ourselves increasingly alienated from our primal experiences, our embodied experiences of reality. Alienation, he argues, proceeds in three phases: the alienation of the human being from nature, the alienation of human beings from their own bodies, and finally, the alienation of human beings from their own minds. Here's how he puts it in the essay. Quote, "The vaunted progress of knowledge which has been going on since the 17th century has been progress in alienation. The alienation first of nature from humanity, which the exclusive pursuit of objectivity and science entails, was the first stage. And it was followed with the acceptance of man himself, the human being, as part of nature so alienated, by the alienation of man from himself," says Barfield. "The final and fatal step in reductionism occurred in two stages. First, his body, and then his mind. Newton's approach to nature was already, by contrast with older scientific traditions, a form of behaviorism. And what has since followed has been its extension from astronomy and physics into physiology and ultimately into psychology." So here's what Barfield's saying. By reducing nature to a story of particles and their relations, and so removing from the world its dynamic, vital, and souled quality and meaning, we discover ourselves in a vast material machine, subject either to mechanical or stochastic laws, rather than in a cosmos replete with inescapable meaning. But having discovered that we dwell in such a universe, we don't wait long until we discover that the body too is subject to these very modes of mechanical understanding, at which point the very life of the body becomes essentially unintelligible, and we begin to suspect that we ourselves are nothing but anticipatory corpses. Finally, we turn the analysis onto the very consciousness doing the analyzing, and we dissolve our very selves into the pulverized bits of universe to which we've reduced everything else. But having begun with an image of the real things of the world as so many vacuous actualities in extrinsic relations to one another, how are we to find our way back to mind, or meaning, or body? Within the alienated register of a certain modernity, there simply is no way out. But Barfield thinks we may be able to take, as Heidegger would put it, a step back, through a critical examination of the way in which we relate ourselves to accounts of the deep past. Now, generalizing rather broadly, Barfield thinks we can contrast our current mindscape. I don't like the term, he borrowed it from Rossack. We can contrast our current mindscape with the mindscape that prevailed for roughly 2,500 years, from, say, ancient Greek culture until the early scientific revolution. The pre-modern view, which differs radically among its adherents, nevertheless was largely marked by a common assumed intercommunion between the human being and nature, a nuptial relationship of mind and matter, or microcosm and macrocosm, that went beyond the mere passivity of sensation and the activity of manipulation. That world, that mindscape, comes to something like a cultural halt in the 17th or 18th centuries. Now, you can blame Descartes for that if you want, but he's probably more of a Richter scale than an earthquake, in my opinion. And the transformation had been prepared for in a number of ways, not least through the transformations wrought by late medieval nominalism and voluntarism, as Ivan Illich, Eric Allier, Charles Taylor, Catherine Pickstock, and others have persuasively argued. However it came about, by the end of the 18th and 19th century, the alienation of mind and matter, value and fact, interiority and exteriority, had become, as Barfield puts it, the subliminal reality principle of vast numbers of educated people in the West. Now you might ask, does anyone really live this way? After all, people still pay attention to Mercury when it goes retrograde. They undergo Jungian therapies. They worship, pray, read poetry, and spend money on the bizarre products that Gwyneth Paltrow hawks. They may do all of these and many other things that cut against the materialism of our age, but Barfield isn't interested in these sites of ideological skirmish, but rather in the persistence of alienation as a subliminal conviction. At the base of the largely hegemonic Western imagination, he argues, there is a mental habit that takes for granted, for all practical purposes, and for most theoretical ones, that the human psyche is intrinsically alienated from matter. In other works, Barfield compellingly shows how this unfolding alienation is inscribed into the changing shapes of our words themselves, and so inscribed into the very tools by which we might otherwise seek to think about or even resist this alienation. It thus presents itself as common sense, or a reality principle. Feel free to believe whatever you like, but your imagination belongs to the forces of alienation. The sheer weight of this epical mental habit is discouraging, and it might seem as if resistance is futile. But observing the events of the 1960s, Barfield felt like he could see signs that the epoch of alienation might eventually buckle under its own weight. He points, for example, to the creation of alternative communities, alternative pedagogical communities especially, communities and institutions that seek to base their common social life on assumptions at odds with the prevailing habits of alienation. CIIS, I think, is one such community, born out of the same cultural ferment. Barfield lists others, including the Human Potential Movement, Back to the Land movements, Friends of the Earth, Resurgence, Findhorn. He could easily have added Aurobind, Shantivana, and a host of others. There are also a number of other disciplines and practices that suggest the breakdown of alienation. Certain types of anti-Cartesian, anti-reductionistic psychotherapy, for example, alternative healing practices from acupuncture to homeopathy, the accumulating evidence for parapsychological effects, and the kind of Goethean science and other works carried on under the auspices of the anthroposophical movement, all attract Barfield's attention. Here too he mentions the psychedelic renaissance of the 1960s, recently revived in our own time, the discovery of Eastern spiritualities by the West, and the rediscovery of Western contemplative traditions, to say nothing of the reluctantly but inevitably anti-Cartesian tenor of quantum mechanics. Now, I'll try to return to Barfield if I have time at the end, but first I want to complicate his reading of the signs of the times by placing his account alongside that of the Italian political philosopher Augusto del Noce. Del Noce penned a number of essays responding directly to the student protests of the 1960s, protests that took place not only across North America and in Paris, but also, you might recall, in London, Berlin, and Del Noce's own Rome. Del Noce is sympathetic to the motives behind the student protests. The students' quote, restlessness and impatience, their mistrust of their elders, are in themselves positive phenomena. Indeed, they express human nature's rebellion against the distinctive process of desecration and dehumanization at the same time that characterize the dominant societal approaches of the day. Del Noce writes, they do not want to belong to this system as instruments, which incidentally would be unavoidable because the society of well-being knows only instruments. I'll say more about what Del Noce calls here the society of well-being in a moment. He also calls it the affluent or technological society, and believes that together with Soviet-style Marxism, these compromise the dominant European and North American societal options of the mid-20th century. The students are right to refuse these options, he says, but he worries that the protests misdiagnose their ailments. In the midst of this entirely justifiable resistance to what would become the most materially destructive organization of life in Earth's history, the ideology of the affluent society was mistakenly identified with tradition, which leads students to redeploy precisely the very categories upon which the affluent society itself depends, namely the supposed contrast of tradition and progress, conservative and liberal, religion and science, or whatever iteration you like of the tendency to ascribe axiological value to modernity. This tendency is not new to the 20th century. You can find it in the past in millenarian movements or Joachim de Fiore's spiritual Franciscanism, and you can see it redeployed with a special force in early Enlightenment notions of modernity, sort of as humanity having come of age. Right? That's what he means by the ascribing axiological value to modernity. Simply being new, simply being what is now, is taken to be a marker, an indication of success in terms of value. So, taken to its extreme, this Enlightenment ascription of axiology to modernity entails the total reconstruction of culture. In the 20th century, this tendency that was present already in our past reappeared with new force. I think in part because of the effects of the First and Second World War, which were taken as a kind of historical revelation, right? Why is it that the sense of modernity's inherent value returns with such force? If not because something new had shown itself in the 20th century. The horrors of the 20th century were taken to be an unprecedented unveiling of the true nature of things. So taken to its extreme, you then begin to think that no matter what, whatever went before needs to be gotten rid of. What we need to do is just focus on building the new. This is, I think, the right way to understand Jack Weinberg's Don't Trust Anyone Over 30 from the 1960s. It's not that people who are 35 or 42 or whatever are inherently untrustworthy, but it's that they hadn't lived through that. It's that they had been formed and educated before the events of the middle of the 20th century. And so they couldn't understand the new as it was supposedly being unveiled. Now, both Del Noce and Barfield take history and its contingencies extremely seriously, but they both held that history cannot be taken seriously if it is absolutized in the way that modernity does. Only an equally historical and metaphysical approach allows us to understand the material events of history, recent or otherwise. As Del Noce put it in an early work, thinking in relation to the present historical context does not mean denying the eternity of metaphysical problems, but recognizing them in their true sense, because it is necessary that we unburden metaphysical thought of the immobilization and formulas that makes it liable to look like the alienated image of a certain historical situation. Rather than following from a hidden rejection of eternity, the recognition of historical context is motivated by the need not to confuse eternity and time. So then how do we diagnose the transformations of the mid-20th century and perhaps the transformations that we're still undergoing in our own day? Del Noce's most distinctive and controversial thesis is that the philosophical and spiritual contours of the affluent or technological society can be traced directly to what he calls the decomposition of Marxism. Barfield's account of alienation is remarkably similar to Del Noce's reading of the affluent society, but Barfield pays precious little attention to the political and institutional forms that implement and enforce these basically imaginative convictions about the nature of reality. Perhaps this is because Barfield was British, whereas Del Noce lived in closer proximity to both fascism and revolutionary Marxism in Italy of the mid-20th century. He could also see the affluent society emerging victorious, as it were, on the backs of both. 30 years before the fall of the Soviet Union and the apparent triumph of the neoliberal order, Del Noce could see it coming. Aristotle holds that we only understand something dynamic if we watch it as it comes into being and grows. So what did Del Noce see as the affluent society was coming into being? He sees this emergent order as related in some ways to a fundamental perversion or parodic expression of Marxism. Marxist revolutionary thought, he claims, effectively ended up being the occasion for the fulfillment of the bourgeois spirit in the so-called technological society. I use this expression here, I'm quoting Del Noce, I use this expression here to indicate a society characterized not by increasing scientific and technical activity, but rather by the concept of instrumental reason, that is, by the interpretation of all human activity in terms of technical activity. Still quoting Del Noce, I would like to propose the following definition. It is, the affluent society, is a society that accepts all of Marxism's negations against contemplative thought, religion, and metaphysics, that accepts, therefore, the Marxist reduction of ideas to instruments of production, that, on the other hand, rejects the revolutionary, messianic aspects of Marxism, and thus what is still religious in the revolutionary idea. In this regard, it truly represents the bourgeois spirit in its pure state, the bourgeois spirit triumphant over its two traditional adversaries, transcendent religion and revolutionary thought. The affluent society, in other words, is not the result of the progress of science and technology. It's not humanity come of age, but is instead a kind of de-romanticized Marxism, a quasi-Marxian philosophy that knows no real revolutionary hope and can permit no Walter Benjamins. Del Noce writes, the affluent society is the only one in world history that does not originate from a religion, but rises essentially against religion, even if paradoxically this religion against which it rises is Marxism. The affluent society can also be described as the society of well-being, the culture of wellness or comfort. This is the first and primary characteristic of the affluent society, the replacement of transcendent or transpersonal ideals with deracinated and essentially conservative goal of pure comfort. The question isn't one primarily of prosperity or of its absence, but rather of the goal of society. Because it can, in principle, know no other goals, the affluent society effectively makes well-being the highest social and even moral goal. This yields a number of consequences, including, in the first place, the replacement of philosophy with practical science in the quest for the good life. It isn't through moral deliberation, philosophical reflection, and careful metaphysical speculation. It isn't through embodied pedagogies and the conversations we have with one another in quest for the good, the true, and the beautiful that we discover the goal of life, but rather through computation, innovation, and design that we in the affluent and technological society hope to discover our heart's desire. The crucial point here is that the motive force in the emergence of the affluent society is not material, technological, or for that matter, epistemological. It's a moral revolution, the kind to which Nietzsche taught us to pay attention. As philosophers will know, for all of its appeal to science, scientism is finally incoherent, insofar as its epistemological standards cannot be secured according to their own procedures. Science cannot tell us that science itself enjoys special or exclusive purchase on the real, which means that any commitment to scientism can only be based on a resolution of the will, which is to say a moral resolution, the resolution to accept as real only that which can be verified empirically by everyone. Couple quick last points. This scientism, this elevation of science to the absolute model of knowledge, effectively elides human interiority, something that both Barfield and Del Noce saw being played out in the revolutions of the 1960s. Moving more quickly, in the third place, absolute scientism entails an absolute secularity, or the end of religions, or more specifically, the elimination not of religions, but of what Del Noce calls the religious dimension of human experience, the presence of and desire for the divine that is operative in homo religiosus, as Mircea Eliade named us, the dimension that manifests precisely in the concern for meaning, purpose, and so forth, that scientism treats as nonsensical because it falls outside of its canons of verifiability. All of which provides the conditions for the fourth characteristic of the affluent society, namely the totalitarianism of the society of well-being, in which culture is made entirely subordinate to politics. The culture that must be made subordinate to politics is summed up by Del Noce under the moniker Platonism, which he takes to be as a shorthand for the experience of religious transcendence and contemplative reason. The new totalitarianism, by contrast, describes a world of radical anti-Platonism in which neither transcendence nor contemplation, nor the dimension of ideal and symbolic value have any place. A world conceived instead as a system of forces and not of values. As Del Noce's translator Carlo Lancellati puts it, rejection of transcendence has the effect that all human realities, the state, sexuality, work, the family, lose their symbolic or ideal significance and become dumb, completely devoid of any finality beyond the satisfaction of the immediate material or psychological needs that can be studied empirically. The common sense assumption that totalitarian threats of the 20th century have passed is a dangerous illusion. Totalitarianism has evolved, but precisely evolved so that it can seem to disappear. The essence of totalitarianism, thinks Del Noce, reflecting especially on his experience of such regimes during his youth, lies in the negation of the universality of reason, so that any form of opposition to established power supposedly does not express rational concerns, but merely conceals the interests of class according to communism, or race according to Nazism. Totalitarian systems, in other words, effectively monopolize power by claiming that rationality is always, already, ineluctably political, thereby ensuring that any criticism can be dismissed a priori as merely ideological. As a consequence, in a kind of perverse communicatio idiomatum, not only is reason politicized, but politics is absolutized. Everything cultural must become political, and the idea of politics is subsumed within the idea of war. I've pretty much come to the end of my time, so I'll just close with a couple sentences on the pedagogical implications of this. Both Del Noce and Barfield think that the problem lying at the root of the emergence of the culture of alienation, the culture of affluence, the technological society, is a problem that has to do with the loss of the human spirit, the loss of our capacity to believe our own inclinations and to follow our own inclinations, to ask meaningful questions, not only about my end, individually, but about the end of all things, the end of our societies, the end of material well-being, the end of the earth. Having foreclosed the very categories, the very tools by which we might ask those questions, we find ourselves necessarily interpolated by a materialistic society of consumption and commodification, one that hides the very fact that we've been so interpolated by using soft power rather than the coercive strong power of the totalitarian governments of the mid-20th century. What might be the effects of what might sort of resistance of a radical pedagogy, or what kind of resistant radical pedagogies might we imagine in order to transform and aerate that system, in order to allow that system, as Barfield put it, to begin to buckle under the weight of its own contradictions? I hope that we'll have a conversation about some of those pedagogies, and I hope it's something that we've been trying to accomplish here at this institute and in this building by bringing not only the mind, but the entirety of the human soul, body, mind, spirit, desire, imagination, into inquiries about the things that ultimately matter and that ultimately orient the highest of our loves. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Jim. Very nice and stimulating talk. And we move on now to Matt Segal. Matt Segal is a process philosopher who teaches courses on process relational thought and German idealism for the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program at CIIS. In the spring 2018 semester, he taught a course called Process and Difference in the Pluriverse, which applied process relational metaphysics to the present social, political, and ecological crisis. He has published widely, and his most recent book is titled Physics of the Word Soul, The Relevance of Alfred Whitehead's Philosophy of Organism to Contemporary Scientific Cosmology. He blogs regularly at Footnotes to Pedagogy.
Thank you, Debashish, and thank you, Jake, for going first. It's nice to hear some resonances in what I want to say, so I'm really looking forward to the conversation after. So my paper is called From Final Knowledge to Infinite Learning, with help from Whitehead and Gilles Deleuze. A few brief remarks to preface what I want to present here. I like to think Whitehead through Deleuze, not only because they're both process thinkers, but because Whitehead was writing a century ago. There's a bit of colonial residue in a lot of his books, where he'll sometimes unironically refer to savages and things like this. I think the spirit of his thought is certainly redeemable in a contemporary context, but I think Deleuze helps with some of these problems in Whitehead's thought. But on the other hand, Deleuze can also sometimes be a thinker who kind of, I would say, likes to go skinny dipping in the rivers of hell and just embraces chaos without any clear, anything salvageable that can be easily communicated to we mere mortals. Whitehead, I think, helps to rein him in a bit and give, even though Whitehead's not easy to read either, to give expression to some of these deep ideas in a way that's relevant to the sciences, that's relevant to humanities, that's relevant to education. Whitehead was, along with being a physicist, a mathematician, philosopher, and metaphysician, he was an educator and lectured widely about pedagogy. Okay. So, California Institute of Integral Studies was founded in 1968 by the integral philosopher Haridas Chaudhuri. Dr. Chaudhuri's integral vision will function for me today as an invitation to re-envision education as an ongoing process whereby the human and the cosmos are brought into ever more intimate contact with one another. In Chaudhuri's words, I quote, "The more we understand the essential structure of the universe as a whole, the more we gain insight into the structure of humanity. The obverse is also true. the more we understand the essential structure of the human, the more we gain insight into the unfathomable mystery of being. It's from his book, The Evolution of Integral Consciousness. For the purposes of our panel on experimental philosophy and pedagogy, I will interpret Dr. Chaudhry's insight in the following way. As integral philosophers, we must match our evolutionary cosmology with an evolutionary epistemology. And as integral educators, we must ground our epistemology in pedagogy. This raises a series of questions that I will try to untangle in my talk. If we claim to know something as philosophers, how is it that we came to know it? And how are we to share and review this knowledge and our method of arriving at it with our colleagues and with students? And as spiritual practitioners embedded in learning communities, how do we adapt our educational activities and our theory of learning to the fact of an ensouled, evolving cosmos? And finally, what is the purpose of the university in an evolutionary universe like ours? In accepting Dr. Chaudhry's invitation to re-envision education in more integral terms, I'm turning for help to the philosophies of education of two other 20th century thinkers, Whitehead and Deleuze. In what follows, I will summarize each of their perspectives and attempted answers to these questions that I've raised. So almost 30 years ago, Deleuze described the transition from a disciplinary society, where individuals were ruled by environments of enclosure, such as factories, hospitals, schools, prisons, and so on, to what he called a control society, wherein power is no longer localized in institutions, but distributed across networks. We now have more access to information than ever before, but our every move is tracked by increasingly invasive surveillance technology. So we are surrounded by screens whose media content is tailored specifically to our desires. Pop-up ads appear on our smartphones before we even become conscious of our desire for the product being sold to us. So in a sense, even our desire is being constructed and shaped by these technologies. We are no longer free individuals, but nodes in vast corporate-owned relational databases. Questions of the fragility of human freedom and of liberal democracy itself have come to the fore. For example, in a recent op-ed in The Guardian, the Israeli historian Yuval Noah Harari argues that in this new context, the idea of liberal freedom, the foundation of the modern West's political and educational institutions, is essentially make-believe and must be discarded. What we put in its place is not entirely clear. If the individual freedom imagined by liberalism has become an impossible fiction, how might we reimagine our human potentials in the context of a new, more networked environment? How are educators to respond to this situation? Now, Whitehead articulated his pedagogical theory a century ago when the coming collapse of a disciplinary society was not yet fully apparent. Universities remained among the most powerful and important institutions in the world, a source of great hope for the future of the species. Times have changed, but his ideas for reforming education, which, as we will see, cannot be separated from his ideas for reforming metaphysics and cosmology, remain as relevant as ever. While at Harvard, Whitehead witnessed the founding of one of America's first business schools. He suggested at the time that a great function awaiting American universities was to civilize business by cultivating socially constructive motives in business students. This, he hoped, would shape their motives such that the amassing of fortunes would be pursued not as an end in itself, but as a means to the betterment of humankind. Things have not panned out as he hoped. As Deleuze put it in his essay on the rise of control societies, today's schools have been delivered over to corporations to serve as perpetual training facilities. Their sole purpose is now to prepare children to join the workforce. In our historical moment, Whitehead's pedagogical theory serves as an act of resistance against the corporate takeover of education. His theory is motivated by two related premises. First, students are alive. Second, the purpose of education is to stimulate and guide their self-development. Now, these seem like obvious things to say. Students are alive. But in especially the industrial era in which we live, and even in a controlled society, that can't be taken for granted. We are living organisms, right, with interior desires and purposes and goals, and we grow and develop. So such development would naturally feed the growth of the species as a whole. But not only that, for Whitehead, social construction is not just a human activity. It is the aim of the universe, which is to say that it functions at all levels, physical, biological, psychological, even theological, to further the evolutionary adventure of cosmogenesis. Education works on our motives. It builds our values. It is not just about memorizing rules, facts, and figures, and certainly it is not just about job training. It is about intensifying our capacity to consciously participate in the realization of truth, of goodness, and of beauty. Whitehead's theory of education is a protest against dead knowledge and inert ideas. Inert ideas are those which are merely received into the mind without having been tested, utilized, or brought into fresh combination. Education in inert ideas is not only useless, it is harmful. It assumes that the human mind is a dead instrument, just awaiting information, an assumption that ends up forming dead minds. Learning often requires rigor, but should never become a chore. Learning is intrinsically enjoyable, Whitehead says, because the general ideas that it can engender within us can bring us understanding of that stream of events which pours through our life, which is our life. There is only one subject matter for education, Whitehead writes, and that is life in all its manifestations. Whitehead describes education as a recurring cycle of first romantic allurement, then precise specialization, and finally free generalization. And then the cycle begins again. He says, quote, "We should banish the idea of a mythical far-off end of education. Education is not only a lifelong, but an infinite task. In Whitehead's universe, if there is to be any immortality, any transcendence, you might say, it is only through profound education that we might become adequate to it. There is no final system to memorize because we do not inhabit a finished cosmos. Ours is a cosmogenesis. Whitehead's novel process relational ontology, his ensouled cosmology, and his imaginative pedagogical theory all arose together out of the revolutions in 20th century mathematics and physics. The material world is not determined by eternal laws in Whitehead's cosmology. The fact of the matter is that matter is an act. Which is not to say that matter is an illusion. Rather, matter, in Whitehead's cosmology, is the result of an ongoing expressive activity. Here it becomes clear that Whitehead's theory of education cannot be separated from his process relational ontology. He's no idealist or social constructionist, as this term is usually understood. For him, construction is a cosmological activity, rooted in a creative principle that precedes human beings and that we participate in. It follows that education is a cosmic activity, something the universe is doing through us, and simultaneously something that we as conscious beings are doing to the universe. As the romantic philosopher, poet, novelist put it, our vocation is the education of the earth. There's no end to education. It is an infinite task. Whitehead thus believed that education should coincide with the cultivation of a reverence for the eternal present. He says, the present contains all that there is. It is holy ground, for it is the past, and it is the future. He says the foundation of reverence is this perception that the present holds within itself the complete sum of existence, backwards and forwards, the whole amplitude of time, which is eternity. So, turning to Deleuze now, in 1968, he published Difference and Repetition, a text that attempts to transform Immanuel Kant's transcendental method, which had claimed to provide a priori knowledge of the general form of all possible experience, into an initiatory approach to open-ended learning and concept creation that is responsive to actual occasions of experience. It is from learning, Deleuze tells us, not from knowledge that the transcendental conditions of thought must be drawn. Deleuze continues, now writing with his frequent co-author, Felix Guattari, when something occurs, the self that awaited it is already dead, or the one that would await it has not yet arrived. There is thus, according to Deleuze, something both fatal and amorous about the learning process. Education can be both destructive and productive of our subjectivity. We are not the same subject before and after an occasion of learning. Learning is thus transformative. Learning is more than mere imitation as well. It's more than a pre-established subject's attempt to mirror a prefabricated knowledge. Imitation can be helpful in a secondary corrective way, Deleuze tells us, but only after the learning process has already been initiated. How precisely this initiation occurs is difficult to spell out. Deleuze suggests that learning is instigated semiotically by way of an encounter with signs. Learning is the interpretation of and response to signs, where the response does not resemble the sign, but rather actively unfolds what is enveloped within it. We learn through differential repetition and not reproduction of the same, since each new encounter with a sign invokes a novel conceptual constellation in the learner, aiming to unfold whatever the sign is unfolding. Deleuze gives the example of learning to swim. He writes, "The movements of the swimming instructor which we reproduce on the sand bear no relation to the movements of the wave, which we learn to deal with only by grasping the former in practice as signs." So learning is thus as much a practical sensory motor task as it is an intellectual or theoretical one. We learn only by transforming ourselves, body and soul. In learning, we are always becoming something else. Our faculties are pushed beyond their limits and forced to overcome themselves, synesthetically spilling into and out of one another. Thinking conceives of problems whose solutions can only be kinesthetically enacted, for example, learning to swim. Just as sensation presents problems whose solutions can only be thought, for example, a child's first encounter with a mirror. Thoughts become sensible, sensations become thinkable. Thus Deleuze tells us, I quote, "Learning always takes place in and through the unconscious, thereby establishing the bond of a profound complicity between nature and mind." Let's skip ahead a bit so we can get to Joshua. So Deleuze laments the way that the Western philosophical tradition has tended to subordinate the learning process to the product of knowledge, such that learning is treated as a mere intermediary, leading from ignorance to wisdom. The learner is likened to a rat in a maze where the end goal is predetermined, rather than needing to be invented anew in each pedagogical participant's encounter with a problem. He gives the example of Hegel, who, despite the way his famous text, The Phenomenology of Spirit, recounts an extraordinary apprenticeship and a learning process, it nonetheless ends up subordinating this process to the final end product of absolute knowledge. So what is education becoming in today's networked control society? What is the role of the university in our increasingly imperiled planetary civilization? These are huge questions that I cannot pretend to have answered. If universities are going to be vaporized into virtual campuses, can so-called online education successfully enact the integral pedagogical approach briefly explored here? I don't know, but there are at least some positive signs. Universities have long been driven by the desire to preserve and pass on the flame of knowledge won by past luminaries. This remains a noble and important responsibility, but perhaps today, our most urgent task as university educators is to inspire hope by imagining and working to build futures worth living in. However, in so doing, we must also cultivate a reverence for the present, for the eternal moment, for we can never leave this moment as if to inhabit some past golden age or some future utopia. Integral philosophers like Chaudhary, Whitehead, and Deleuze invite us to inhabit the profound and generative mystery of the learning process here and now. Everywhere and always, learning remains an infinite task. Integral education is a lifelong practice of participation in the creative energy of the cosmos. There is no final exam, though as Deleuze as well as Socrates and Plato knew, part of this participation is also learning to die. If education is preparation for anything, we can only say that it is a preparation for death. And the best way to prepare to die is to discover the best way of living well. This is the end that education should serve. The search for final knowledge becomes a practice of infinite learning when knowing is placed back in the context of the eternal cosmic cycle of life and death. The human mind is not an instrument to be sharpened, a wax tablet to be informed, or a birdcage to be tamed. Each mind is rather a unique living personality seeking creative expression. In the evolution of life, we're fundamentally witnessing a process of learning. This evolutionary process is creative rhythm, differential repetition, fractal reproduction. Life is thus in sync with death, as death beats bodies into form, generating by eliminating what does not serve the growth of life as a whole. Learning is thus the heart of all life. Thank you.
Thank you, man. Another very beautiful and stimulating talk. So we move on now to Joshua Rami. Joshua is visiting assistant professor in interdisciplinary program in peace, justice, and human rights at Haverford College. Rami holds a PhD in philosophy from Villanova University, and his research is in political economy, critical theory, and the philosophy of religion. He is the author of The Hermetic Deluge, Philosophy and Spiritual Ordeal, and Politics of Divination, Neoliberal Endgame in the Religion of Contingency. So I turn it over to Josh.
Thank you. Thank you, Debashish, and Matt and Jacob. It's really good to be with both of you again. Be back at CIIS. I was here 5 years ago at Jacob's invitation when I was starting to work through some of the ideas that became the neoliberalism book on markets has divinatory devices, false ones, bad ones, but nevertheless. So it's good to be back here again, and still talking about capitalism, sorry. But in a more specific way, actually, today what I want to talk about is capitalism as a form of war and warfare, which picks up directly on, I'm not sure if Barfield or Del Noce, the idea of politics is basically war, and this assumption of culture and politics being tantamount to war. So I want to talk a little bit about that, and then also about dying and then pedagogy for death. So I am the Gothic presentation today. It's war and death. I don't really want to apologize for that because it's very important. I don't think that I know very well how to learn to be at war or to learn how to die. And I think it maybe is the greatest challenge for all of us. But for me, at this moment, this is the edge for me, how to learn how to be at war, which is not the same thing at all as how to be violent, and also how to die, which is also not moribund at war. It's gothy, but it's not moribund. That's what I want to talk about. And so the first half of the talk is going to be about what I think is very helpful and important, actually, for us to understand that capitalism has become, over the course of the 20th century, especially since '68, what Deleuze called the war machine. And that economics is basically war by any and all means necessary, which some of you may pick up on being a reversal of Clausewitz's formula that war is the extension of politics by other means. I think what we're living in is economics as war by any and all means. That's what capitalism has effectively become. And I think that really got going after '68 and after the failures of the insurrectionary movements to sustain themselves, which I don't have a theory about, but I think it's very interesting given some of the talks yesterday. I mean, I don't want to say at all that that we should despair over the legacy of '68. I think that it's very powerful, and it's still animating everything from, the Indignados movement and the Nuitibu, Occupy, Standing Rock. But there's obviously new challenges, and those challenges are I think in particular the ones that I'm addressing myself to around the idea of being at war, which I think we need to get more familiar with, and also what it means to die, or to die creatively. So I'll start with a couple of quotations. One's from Jesus of Nazareth in the Gospel of Matthew. "Think not that I am come to send peace on earth. I came not to send peace, but a sword." Second is a quotation from the Guatemalan shaman Martin Pratel. "Violence is the absence of conflict." Violence is the absence of conflict. And the third quotation I want to start with is from Eric Allier and Maurizio Lazzarado's recent book, Wars and Capital. Emerging victorious from the confrontation with the movement and thought of '68, the neoliberal war machine has continued to win victory after victory. These victories come with an erasure of the memory of wars, of civil wars, of the wars of class, race, gender, and subjectivity from which the victors gain their domination. He's talking there, of course, about the ongoing struggles for racial justice, gender equity, so on. The neoliberal erasure. The neoliberalism continuously erases our memory of the struggles and makes us think that we're not actually in them or that they're possible. Walter Benjamin reminds us that reactivating memory and reality of wars and civil wars can only come from the defeated. The fact that the defeated of '68 were unable to see, describe, counteract the transformation of the war and social wars imposed by the enemy demonstrates the weakness of critical theory and represents one of the reasons for the disappearance of revolutionary political war into its inability to divide war and multiply confrontations that could create new war machines. That's a long-winded way of saying we have to renew the struggle. And the struggle is going to look very different today than it did in '68. I was at Standing Rock. I think there's an arrow ahead there, but we can talk about this. Just a little bit more from them before I start my remarks. '68 thought did not show itself capable of producing a strategic knowledge adequate to the civil wars capital was able to restart as an overall response to its global destabilization, which reached its climax in '68. I'll say a little bit about the economic history of that in a minute. As proof, if needed, it is not enough to state that micropolitics has the path to macropolitics to transform it, even though this is often forgotten. Both micro and macro politics have to be included in the multiplicity of wars that take place there, without which both micro and macro politics collapse, and the struggles occurring there lose their consistency in the becoming minor of not many people. Make the one you are fleeing flee, said Deleuze and Guattari, when distinguishing the schizo and the revolutionary. And last remark, the essential limit of '68 thought is inability to think of war in all its components as total form of value creation of capital, relegating its reformist moments to strategic parentheses in the grand capitalist utopia of the free market. According to Eric Allier and Maurizio Lazzarato, the failure of '68 thought is the failure to maintain the adversarial edge of the coalitions between minorities, what they would call the becoming minor of many that was happening at the time, as blacks, women, gays, and lesbians, students, workers, and others were becoming minor together. The failure then is that we have turned on one another in the endless turnings of identity politics and in the futile attempt to win the culture wars. We have failed to maintain a massive minor front that we can fight in and through together. We have failed to remain at war. To make those we are fleeing flee, we must become minor together. Minor, of course, does not here mean minority, since the vast majority of the human population consists in these so-called minorities. Those of color, children, women, the disabled, veterans, the homeless, the enslaved, the trafficked, the exiled, and the refugee. Here comes everybody, minor together. In some sense, we failed because the demand of 68 was in fact met. Another world was made possible, at least for a privileged few. The demand for creative free self-expression and the exploration of higher consciousness was met, if you were white or could pass for it. The demand for meaningful life was tolerated, at least for white middle-class people and their token black, brown, and queer hangers-on, in exchange for the acceptance of global capitalism as the form of world peace. But, as many of us have woken up to since the financial crisis of 2008, this supposed peace is actually war. War on the planet, war on our psyches, war among us all. This is what Allier and Lacerado call total civil war. It is peace bought at the price of ruthless competition between every differentiation of the laboring classes, race, gender, nationality, ability, and every other micro-differentiation weaponized against us as it's quantified, packaged, and speculated on in the form of financial derivatives. I was born in 1975 at the end of the insurrection, the beginning of the rise of the neoliberal state terror apparatus known as the unlimited market, for which the conservative Christian version of Northern California libertarianism I grew up in was a sometimes unwitting and often willing accomplice. I was radicalized by the crash of 2008, by the implosion of the academic job market, by Standing Rock, and with Occupy in between. But before that, in grad school, I was a child of 68 theory, and I still think it's a vision of 68 to which we must return and repeat differently. And that's what my title is about in the program, Intensifying the Contradiction. And that's what I want to, they're asking us to return to. Here I am, here we are. I came of age in the radically depoliticized 90s and noughts, and for a while, I thought I could meditate and do enough psychedelics and participate in evolutionary consciousness and ignore the vulgarity of Clinton and the stupidities of Bush. But now I know that consciousness is not enough. It's not nothing. In fact, it's essential for the struggle, supported by places like this one, like Oroville, and others. But consciousness is not enough. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. There's also the struggle. If Allier and Lacerado are right, the failure of 68 was not the failure to bring in world peace. It was the failure to sustain the struggle, the war. We have to return to the fundamental contradictions in the post-68 settlement, the contradiction between creative free self-expression and consciousness exploration on the one hand, and the capitalist conditions for life and death on the other. The contradiction between individual healing on the one hand and collective and terrestrial struggle against the capitalist war machine on the other. My only suggestion, really, my only thought today is that we must not resolve, but intensify this contradiction. We must renounce the trade-off of tokenism and the politics of recognition and return to trans-individuality and the politics of collective struggle. And again, there are many signs that we're already doing this and trying to do it, but we're obviously trying to do it in an extremely imperiled and exhausted moment, which is what I want to come to in a minute, how we deal with our exhaustion. We must refuse the betrayal of desire by pleasure, the betrayal of knowledge by information, the betrayal of war by peace. We have to learn to be at war together again, to take up the call of Christ, to bring peace, not a sword, I'm sorry, not peace, but a sword, and to take up, see, I can't even say it, Lord. That's how far gone we are. To bring not peace, but a sword. And by the way, it's a good day for swords because it's the feast of St. Michael and all angels. So, get out your sword. To bring peace, not peace, but a sword. And to take up the challenge of the Guatemalan shaman Martin Cartel that violence is the absence of conflict. We must re-engage in conflict in order to stop the violence of the total civil war of capitalist peace. And partly what's at stake here is that we have never fully understood the enemy since '68, and maybe we're starting to. That's what we're waking up to. Let me give a quick analysis here of why we should call economics war at this point, and then I'll turn to Vanessa Andreotti's work on how to educate ourselves in this situation. As I mentioned before, Clausewitz's famous formula was that war is the continuation of politics by other means, and this formula, of course, reflects a different political situation, that of the early modern nation state, the sort of Walrasian settlement. Clausewitz's basic idea was that the nation state doesn't really want to be at war, but it only really desires to do this to protect its interests, and will go to war when those are threatened. And thus, even when the protection of state interests do extend to warfare, this is only for the sake of returning as quickly as possible to the peace of a détente. But according to Deleuze-Guattari, in the Thousand Plateaus, which Allier and Lostrado follow, since World War I, the true nature of war has been revealed as the war machine that it truly is. And what was it that was revealed in the mechanization and the creation of the industrial military complex is the following, that even though the state, as understood as a political entity, aspires to some kind of order or stability or uniformity, doesn't really want to be at war, capitalism nevertheless profits directly from and is in fact interested in perpetuating total war, not necessarily and always an overt armed conflict, but a much more insidious kind of war against populations, which is what Matt was referring to with his reference to the control society. And this is very much what financialization is all about, and I think we're starting to understand this more and more, that financialization is really about surveillance and control. It's really not about profit. This is very important to understand because the smart currencies, the blockchain ledger, and so on are already being rolled out by people like Jeff Bezos to weaponize early childhood education, to make poverty something that can be the subject of direct investment. This is sort of the frontier here. But the basic idea is that financialization, which is the one way of thinking about the neoliberal era we've been in, is it's all about indexing and pricing and making it possible to speculate on differentials. And thanks to derivatives, finance can profit as much from destruction as from creation, as much from depreciation as appreciation. All capital needs is a market. All it needs is some contingency or some chance, as I wrote about in my last book. So in order to create enough volatility for there to be speculation, we want to destabilize the earth, we want to destabilize social life, we want to undermine any and all ways of human solidarity to make people dependent on powers that be. And this is exactly what Allier and Lostrado call the situation of total civil war, or the war of the populations, the war within populations. Thank you. Yeah, and this goes by other names: bio and necropower, quantification and tokenization of any and all human differentiations as the site of speculation. And this, in fact, becomes what is known as peace. A peaceful situation in our era is a situation in which capitalism is able to run its program of war on the population unimpeded, in an unrestricted way. That is peace, and therefore it's worth calling that a monstrous and violent situation, precisely because it disables the one conflict we need to have, which is the conflict with the capitalist extraction machine itself. So I think it's important to frame our situation in that way because it helps us understand also why so many of our social movements that seem so promising, whether it's Occupy or Standing Rock or whatever, hit these incredibly powerful walls that are walls of exhaustion, walls of physical danger, obviously the repressions of police state apparatus like we talked about with Oakland Occupy yesterday. But we really need to understand the challenge in terms of how to be at war, and because I think that affects what kind of pedagogy we need at this point. So this leads to the second half of my remarks, and I'll condense this a little bit for the interest of time. This comes to how we can learn to die, how we can learn to be, as it were, willing to die. What would it mean? Because in a way, if one of the failures of '68 was to trade a false peace for over war, the other failure might be characterized as the willingness to trade death for a false life. And this relates directly to the affluent society. The problem with the affluent society is not that it's not pleasurable or comfortable. That is the problem with it, right? So we need to learn how to be in discomfort, in kind of radical discomfort, and that's what I'm talking about here. So, and this is where I want to turn to the educational theorist Vanessa Andreotti, who's at the University of British Columbia. Is anybody familiar with her work? I can't recommend her highly enough. She talks about the fact that I'm gonna read a little bit of words from her because she's some really great language around this. But she basically says that we need to learn to live outside what she calls the house, and the house is the structure that protects us from the very world that we need communion with, need to learn from, need to learn with. Go back to the Whitehead point. And the house is built by four walls. One wall is capitalism, one wall is the nation state, one wall is a single universal conception of rationality, and another wall is the presumed separability between individual human beings and either other human beings or other species or the cosmos itself. So those are the four walls. For her, they all need to go, but she works with, and burn the whole house down, but she works with communities, mainly in Latin America, who are trying to do without at least three of the four walls. So that's where her work is sort of coming from. And the struggle of that is something she describes in a recent interview with Rob Hopkins as a podcast. I can give you the reference for this. So here's what she says. I'm just going to read this quote from her and then summarize some kind of bullet points, what I think the takeaways are, and then that'll be it for me. So this is Vanessa. These are her words. In many ways, our struggle can be compared to an addiction process where we get dopamine, serotonin, and oxytocin in certain ways. And of course, there are infinite possibilities, different configurations, but this one, the house, which we described, is just the most available one. What would it take for us to choose to be in withdrawal? What would it take for us to choose to be in withdrawal? To try different things. This is part of what we're asking through the collectives that she works with. We don't have the stamina. We don't have the stamina to sit with our denials, our foreclosures, and the difficult things without falling apart internally or without having our relationships fall apart. We can't even start the process because we will keep on defending and protecting our own fragility in doing this. And that's the fragility of the affluent society, you could say, right? Because if you go deep into the violences of the past, you can get caught in a vortex of guilt, blame, and worthlessness and lack of belonging. This is not useful. There's an existential surrender necessary here that's in excess of our knowing. Existential surrender. Then on the other side, to bring, she's talking about bringing new worlds into being, you need similar things that are different, but that are similar but different. Instead of intellectual accountability, which is what we need to be honest about what's happened before, we need a kind of existential accountability, but not as an intellectual choice. It's already something that neurologically we're prone to doing if we can find it. But we also need intellectual surrender. Again, these are her words. The best way I think we can talk about it is allowing the land to dream through you. Allowing the land to dream through you. So allowing the imagination to open to the collective entanglement with things and not thinking it's an individual task. It is something that comes through you. Indigenous people would say through your ancestors, but the ancestors are not only human, and they are not only those who have come before. It's me and you. But what I'm talking about is me in you. Me in you. Me in this bigger metabolism where I'm just part of something that is born and dies every day, a continuous cycle of regeneration. But right now, we are probably stuck somewhere in this cycle and sick and trying to heal ourselves. How do I allow this sickness to pass through me without being afraid of dying or afraid of the pain in this process? Because it's painful already. It's just that the effort that it takes for us to placate the pain is preventing us from doing other things that we can do with pain in terms of opening up other possibilities. I think that's a really important point. I'm going to read it again. The effort that it takes for us to placate the pain is preventing us from doing other things that we can do with pain in terms of opening up other possibilities. How do we go for the seeds rather than looking for our own sense of worth and belonging and value in the things we're doing? That kind of thinking I found in Vanessa, of that kind of sensing actually is not thinking. It comes from the gut. It's a visceral thing about us being those who will come after us. That those who come after us are still us. And my body has a different temporality that spans lifetimes, and I take into account of that as I'm doing something, and I have more patience to learn from my mistakes, so that others can make different ones, not the same one. And so this sense of worthlessness, fear of worthlessness, of pointlessness, of meaninglessness, tends to drive our efforts, but we need to get over this problem with separability, the separation of humans from everyone else in order to confront this, because it's created this idea that we don't have intrinsic value. And what if we remove that fear, that pointlessness, and what would it then be possible for us to do? So those are some of Vanessa's words. Again, I can't recommend her highly enough. So just quickly, what's the pedagogy on offer here? Well, one, these are things that I would try to tell my students. I think we should all try to tell ourselves. One, you are not your identity, or your identity is not you. You are your ancestors. Your ancestors are you. The ancestors are partly in the past and partly in the future. Some of them are human, most of them are not. Two, you are not the mushroom, you're the mycelium. You are not the actualization, you are the repotentiation. You are not the fruit, you are the seed carrier. Three, you are helping things die as much as bringing things into birth. You are performing hospice as much as midwifery. We need to deal publicly with bitterness, rage, and grief. We need more public grief and more well-informed and healing expressions of rage. This is part of what it is to be at war. Four, disillusionment is good. It means you are relinquishing illusions. Be very careful not to individually pathologize depression, anxiety, and lack of attention span. This could be because the house is not worth living in. Five, we cannot imagine a post-capitalist future using our intellect. It has to come from our gut, from our sensorium, from a very different way of feeling in the world, a way that is not assisted by our habitual modes of getting oxytocin, serotonin, and dopamine. We cannot and will not change how we think it is possible to live, or who it is possible to love, unless we change what we can feel good bonding with, and what kind of discomfort we can endure and learn to thrive in. Six, it's not enough to inspire people with new ideas and new visions. The problem we face is not how to model or scale or think or even imagine differently. It's a problem of deep attrition at the level of our sensorium. It's a kind of exhaustion. We've been at war. War has been waged on us for the last 40 years. The evacuation of the welfare state, the destruction of the natural environment, the decimation of modes of human solidarity and interaction that are not monetized. These are wars against our sensorium. These are wars against our ability to feel through discomfort with others into something new. 7, last point. This brings us to the darkest and hardest thing, which is that most of us will not see the fruits of this fight, even if we decide to engage it. We may assist in the mulching and composition of the mycelium, but we will not live to see or even be the mushrooms. This means, for us, maybe this is what we have to teach, that having meaning and purpose may not be the essence of human life, at least not of our individual lives, in a way that we will see or possess in our lifetimes. Last paragraph. As Andreotti points out in the interview, the idea that human life we're living is a life with meaning and purpose is actually a historical construct. It has a genealogy. It may arguably be a white, colonizing, and sexist construct. And her point here should be fairly obvious to any observer. When we think about how we talk, when we say, go find your purpose, it sounds like the hero's quest, or the adventure, or the colonial expedition, or the entrepreneurial self, or the capitalist enterprise. In some ways, even ancient initiatory ordeals are problematic from this perspective because they tend to involve a confrontation with the earth, usually a female Mother Earth, that has to be dominated or tamed or even destroyed in order for order and meaning and purpose to come into human society, in order for the state to emerge, the kingdom, the peace. Now, this is not to argue that there's no such thing as meaning or purpose in some sense, but meaningful for what or for whom? Even thinking about the earth itself, who lavishly gives and sacrificially gives even, cares for each of us radically abundantly, as we continue to insist on our exciting processes of self-discovery. The idea that a life, or a life well lived as a purposeful life, needs to be radically interrogated. In order to have or possess such a life, one has to have a context in which such a life is validated and seen and honored and supported by others. And there has been no Western society, maybe no society, in which it is not abundantly clear that meaningful life is for certain people with certain endowments to attain or fail to attain, and everyone else is there to support them. For some to have meaningful lives, for some to feel sovereign, there must be hierarchy, there must be sacrifice, there must be blood. Whether this is the role of slaves and women in the ancient Greek polis, or the role of colonized or dispossessed peoples, or the poor, the indebted, the racialized, gendered, in the contemporary world, even of animals and plants themselves, of the earth itself, there are entities who, by definition, cannot have meaningful and purposive lives so that others can. If what I'm saying is even remotely true, if there is this much blood on the hands of meaning, why in this case do we need to keep worrying about trying to instill in people a sense of meaning and purpose? Like the crime of founding a new bank compared to burning one down, what is the crime of feeling despair compared with the crime of finding a meaningful, purposeful, happy existence in a world constituted by total capitalist war? But this is not to despair. What we have to teach is the sense of the body as being transtemporal, and this is primarily experiential. And it's where the war is. That's where the struggle is. And it's not a struggle that the disabled, the young, or the most vulnerable are able to engage. They're already under too much pressure. They're too threatened. It must be done by those who can until others can, while we still can. And we can only do it together. Thank you.
Thank you, Joshua. What a talk. Very radical, very beautiful. I think we have half an hour, and we can spend a little time conversing among ourselves. So I think there was a lot of synergy, a lot of parallels in what was discussed. And if I'm to draw a central thread out, I think that there are many threads of connection, and we can probably explore that a little bit and then throw it open to the public, to the audience. Nietzsche has talked about the last man, the fact that sometimes it's really the kind of anodyne of satisfaction that kills us, that kills the humanity within. That the fire dies inside us. And on the other hand, you have this continuous war that's going on. So between the two, on the one hand, the kind of slaying of welfare, and the other hand, the sort of continuous degradation of our life through our instrumentation. We are becoming instruments of the war apparatus. I think we are losing our discontent. This is exactly what's happening, and pedagogy is just an instrument in that process. So I think these were some of the key notions that we need to recover. And in our pedagogy, I believe that, I think apart from the fact of a more holistic understanding of pedagogy, where it isn't just mental understanding, but a visceral understanding, a physical understanding, and a deep understanding, an emotional understanding, that we need to recover these things. Sri Aurobindo would have called it aspiration. And I think one of the things that I really beautiful quote quotations that Joshua gave was this one about existential surrender in excess of our knowing. I think this existential surrender in excess of our knowing, which goes beyond our capacity to actually put a label on where we are going, but which is also in a way the preparation for death, as you called it. You see, that existential surrender in excess of our knowing. So I take these away as points of synergy between the three talks, and I'd like to open up a discussion between us. And if any of you would like to comment more on this, and take it.
I'll offer something. Thank you, Debashish. In listening to Joshua and Jake, I was thinking about, in the context of education, we can explore the extent to which the human capacities, human nature is plastic versus fixed. And certainly the whole point of education is that we're not fixed. And I think about, in the political arena since the French Revolution, how we've fallen into this dichotomy of left versus right, or progressive versus conservative. And at the current time, psychologists and neuroscientists are even they're doing research and producing knowledge which is suggesting that this left-right dichotomy is folded into the very folds of our brain, right? Making it seem like we're stuck here in this dichotomy. And I don't know about you guys, but I'm increasingly sick and tired of that way of framing the struggle. These aren't adequate concepts anymore. Maybe left-right was adequate in a disciplinary society more so than it is now in a control society, when power isn't held in institutions in the way that it was. With power now being more decentralized, which isn't to say that it's not hegemonic, it seems like we need a new way of thinking about politics that isn't broken into this dichotomy, and yet we're constantly having it reinforced, even by scientists telling us that this is just human nature. Some of us are conservative, some of us are progressive, and it has to do with our biology, and maybe at best with our development. But once we're in those, on one side or the other, we're kind of locked in. And I don't think that's true. But how do we break out of that? It's a question that I've had.
Well, this just occurred to me, Matt, while you were speaking. Matt, this just occurred to me while you were speaking that maybe I'm hesitant about this. I want to just offer this as something to maybe take up, but I mean, we might want to take up the idea that maybe not being right or left, or being conservative versus liberal, but becoming rightish or leftist or becoming conservative or liberal has something to do, has a lot to do with the way people experience things like anxiety or fear. There's a lot of research trying to reduce political positioning to affect, to how you're feeling. I mean, I think there's something in that needs to be taken on board. I think that if I'm being honest about the direction my presentation is pointing, because it is a kind of gut level, there's something to be taken up there. I think that the determinism and the you're resisting is right to resist. It's, we're pre-programmed in some sense to be right or left. No, I mean, I think it depends on our experiences, right, and how those can be remediated or healed in some way. But yeah, I mean, what's behind that is the concern I'm sure everyone shares in here, that discourse and discursivity has become impossible. I mean, we're in this this situation of, newspeak from what Brave New World or 1984. I always forget which one that is. But we're in this crazy zone where everything that happens in the media and on social media is this sort of hallucination, and how do you? I feel like so unmotivated to engage people right now at the level of the signs they emit, at the level of the signals they're sending, or the level of the discourse they think they're participating in. Because, if I'm honest about myself, I'm not just pointing a finger at other people. If I'm honest about myself, I don't know how to articulate what I need right now, or what I want right now. So what, do I want someone to engage with me at the level of what I think, which is sort of the simulation of knowledge, or the simulation of information, right, that's being generated by us posting all the time, and by the positionality of the. Anyway, we all know this is a problem. I don't need to describe it, but I'm thinking mainly. My thought was that mainly, maybe in this context, it actually it might be worth shifting to something like a more experiential or affect-based, or some kind of approach, to being with others, to being with people we're unfamiliar with, or whatever. That was just what your remark set me off to. Any thoughts about this?
I think the reification of two political directions as exhaustive of the way in which we can comport ourselves to questions of common pursuit and shared life has become so destructive for our capacity to imagine and construct new social communities, that I'm totally with you on wanting to find a way out of that. I think in one sense, Joshua mentioned some of the ways in which exhaustion and the kind of the failure of even those movements that seem to promise the most is written in, and I think part of the way it's written in is by this reification of just two binary options as describing the manifold capacities of human life and sociality. It's just crazy. When you think about it, that it would be reduced to as if the law of the excluded middle pertained to imaginative creation as opposed to logical operations, and that's and precisely. What it precisely does, I think, is what Joshua was getting at in his description of financialization as profiting off of a kind of as a kind of Hobbesian state of the war of all against all, which is all you can have if you're stuck in this sort of binary opposition. Just even at a metaphysical level, people have been thinking about this for 2,500 years. The second needs a third in order to mediate and to generate, right? It's with the addition of a third, this from Schelling, that the replete generative capacities of life become available, and you're stuck in a kind of inescapable ontology of war, and not the kind of war that Joshua was describing as the noble refusal to be interpolated by the present system.
Uncomfortable refusal.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. And part of my own struggle has been to find this mediating potential without it becoming it's called centrism, because that seems to me to be an example of saying, comfort, capitalism is one. Let's just relax, and we can have our political skirmishes about left and right, but at the end of the day, we know what the right political system is, we know what the right economic system is, let's just relax. We can't relax. So the mediating third possibility between the extreme on either side is not, I don't want to be misunderstood as suggesting we need all to become centrists. No. But I get, the struggle for me is, I get that, as you were describing, Jake, this, in the modern period, this push to, after the world wars especially, like, okay, everything we've been doing is wrong, we need to totally detach, cut ourselves off from the past and create it from scratch, create something new from scratch. That seems dangerous to me, because history is what forms us. And so in some sense, I'm like, yeah, we need to be able to move forward, conserving our history, conserving what we learned from the past, while also recognizing the many injustices of the past and many forms of inequality that need to be overcome. But for me, the question, as someone who's generally progressive and left-leaning, is like, how do we get to where we want to get to from here? We can't just pretend like, the end justifies the means. The means is absolutely essential. So how do we have a more just, equal society? Is war necessary? And maybe it is, sort of civil war, revolutionary war. But there's a lot of cost that comes with that. And trying to weigh the scale of how much killing is worth it in order to get to this end that seems utopian, that seems like part of what the 20th century was about, this search for, especially in the Soviet Union and whatnot. So yeah, I'm struggling with this in myself.
So if I may say something, I think, Jake, you brought up the issue of the degradation of the left in Del Noce, and the idea of the loss of the messianic, the loss of kind of an excess of idealism, if I may use that term. I think that's the basis of the subjective root of the war. I think rekindling that is really the war, because that leads to otherwise we think of war in an instrumental way as well, just as we are thinking of the left and right in an instrumental way. It's really the capital system that both left and right are serving once they've lost their messianism. And would you like to say something about that, Jake, particularly about Del Noce's notion?
Well, so Del Noce's reading, I think, it's more particular to Europe than it is to North America, and so what he calls the decomposition of Marxism was more apparent there than it was for us over here. In one sense, we didn't have to go through the decomposition of Marxism to end up with that same utilitarian values of the affluent society, because it was germinating throughout the 19th century. Yeah. But what he was particularly interested in was the way that Marxists, on my reading, Marx is basically a romantic theorist, and that the messianic aspects of Marx's thought sort of redeploy in a kind of Feuerbachian atheist mode many of the revolutionary religious impulses of the Abrahamic tradition, right? And Walter Benjamin is, I think, the great example of this in the early 20th century. What Del Noce thought he was witnessing was the way in which that romantic side of the Marxian movements of the 20th century had disappeared, really under bureaucratization and these totalitarian impulses. Because you can only sustain that romantic messianic hope if there's a place for culture outside of politics, understood only in terms of bureaucracy and instrument, right? Marx has that deeply cultural sense to him, in which the whole point of revolution is so that we can enjoy cultural goods. It's not revolution just in and of itself. But once everything is indexed instrumentally back to technological production, then there is no place for messianic hope. And I think part of what I took from Josh was really, really moving invocations, especially about the invocations at the end about allowing the ancestors to dream through us, and the land to dream through us, which is really about collective identity. That's achieved. The openness for that space, the porosity to those movements is in a space that's outside of this instrumental plane. And the difficulty we have is to craft a space in which that even becomes possible. Like he said, we're just assaulted, we're besieged by the constant effort to turn everything immediately into an instrumental means. And one thing that I think that radical pedagogy, or just pedagogy in general, in the classical sense, can do is to make that space in which I and not just me, but I and my community, the whole of us, get together in order to do that collectively at a somatic, psychological, and intellectual level.
Yeah. Can I just follow up really quick? I'm really eager to hear what other folks have to say. I just want to be really quick on this. That the couple of things coming up for me. One is that I'm going to put my sort of anarcho-Marxist cards on the table here, because the way I tend to think about the question of revolution and utopian hope, which I think are really important, is that capitalism is the system that prevents us from acting on what we already know we need and desire to be together. So I don't think in terms of, okay, kids, let's imagine a different world. It's let's imagine a world in which capitalism is no longer preventing us from realizing the world that we all know we want and need. I mean, this is very much in the spirit of the early Marx, who, I agree with you. Ultimately, Marx's conception of the human is as a passionate creature, which means driven by imagination, ultimately, in this kind of ecstatic relationship with the world that draws us outside ourselves. And this is later kind of scientistic Marxist views that only read Capital. They're leaving out really crucial elements in Marx's humanism, basically. So I totally agree. But in terms of the project of whatever you want to call it, building the future, imagining the future. I mean, for me, I would say in the last 4 or 5 years, especially, but really all my life, that it is absolutely crucial that we sit at the feet of indigenous peoples and marginalized and oppressed peoples all over the world, because they are the ones who have continued to survive and live human lives, while being at war, in the sense that I've been talking about. This is what I experienced firsthand at Standing Rock. We were there in ceremony, people were being healed, people were expressing themselves, there was joy and abundance of food, abundance of culture, abundance of connection, while we were at war. While we were maintaining, as best we could, the struggle to protect the water, right? So, I mean, it's very important to me as a white person, as someone who comes from white, lower middle class anyway society, that we, in my own case, I'm involved now very deeply in studying, in particular, Afro-Caribbean struggles and the decolonial movements coming out of Latin American thinkers and Afro-diasporic thinkers in particular, because the reason as it relates to this conversation, I think that it's very, very, very easy for white folks in particular, but by white I mean a kind of culture of whiteness that's built around a kind of European way of thinking about progress and development that's rooted in imperialism and extraction and colonialism. It's very easy for us to think that the future is something that we have to build, right? And make, and this is again my problem with meaning and purpose, is that our model for the meaningful life is this kind of, someone does the, what's that? Yeah, and someone assists you in that project, so, you know, whether it's the earth itself or other people, so that there can be these heroes, these exemplars, and these, you know, and I think that model is very pernicious, and it's even in our psyches. You know, we're trying to achieve psychic health on the basis of, you know, subordinating or suppressing or hacking, you know, our consciousness in some other way. So I'm putting this out there as a problem. I have so much work to do in myself on this. I think we all do, but I think we need to be indigenous-led and led by marginalized and oppressed peoples, because I think they're the ones that are carrying the wisdom on this. And I want to acknowledge that, because my own thinking is totally indebted to them, and my own living is too. I think we all need to acknowledge that. So can we get some?
Joshua, thank you for reminding me that today is the feast day of my patron archangel. My name is Michael.
Oh, great.
I was wondering in myself, as I was listening to you, why am I resisting this message? And it came at the end, and I'll tell you a bit about that. At the end, you said most of us will not see the fruits of the fight if we decide to engage in it. And I was thinking, I have considerable resources now. Considerable resources in skills and abilities and financial resources, which I've gained through the market system. And I know about Michael's sword, so I'm thinking, if I take up that sword, will I be like somebody who in 1917 is sitting with Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin, willing to take up the sword, but not really realizing that Stalin was going to prevail? Or would I be like on the Great March, with Cho and Lai and Mao Zedong, not realizing that my affinities are with Cho and Lai, that he was not going to prevail? I'm not against using my resources to take up that sword, but the fruits are so unclear that until they become much clearer to me, I'm just at my stage in life not willing to take the chance.
I mean, I really appreciate your honesty, and it's an incredible, gesture. Thank you. I mean, I want to hear what other people say about this too. I don't want to claim to have any real higher wisdom here. I mean, my immediate response is, I think the answer probably has something to do with Andreotti's line about allowing the earth to dream through us, because I think there is more uncertainty in outcomes than most of us want to live with or are willing to live with. But I also don't think that means it's completely unguided or unmediated. I think it needs to happen in community. I mean, I would, just practically speaking, my advice to you or any of us would be, get with as many people as you can trust. Don't try to make these decisions alone, right? And then use your judgment, to allow your resources to flow, in where you think they're going to be most effective. But because I mean, the future is radically uncertain. What I don't like about, I mean, it's easier to talk about what we don't like. What I don't like about what Jeff Bezos wants to do is he wants to control outcomes of or something like early childhood education, as that's the guarantee he wants. He won't invest unless he knows he's going to see, and I think we have to. I think that we have to trust. We have to radically trust, even beyond, our imagination. And I think this is part of the kind of insidious justification for the way we treat the poor in general. We say, well, I'm willing to help you if you'll tell me how you're going to behave. And I mean, at some point, I just think that's wrong. I think that what Deleuze said is really true. The poor don't need to be asked what they want. They need to be left alone so that what they need is no longer prevented from them, prevented from reaching them. I mean, I think that's where our resources go. I think and I want to hear others. It should be in standing down from the extractive machines that make the poor dependent in the first place. It's not about going in and finding out what poor communities, what programs they need in order to survive their ongoing extraction. It's about standing down from extraction, which is, that's revolutionary. What happens after that, I don't think we can guarantee or we know, but like I was saying earlier, I guess I am a kind of radical humanist in the way that Marx was. I think that human beings have all kinds of tendencies. Some are good and some are bad, but I don't think we can engineer the future. I think we have to stand down from the forces that prevent us from experimenting with what the future might be. And I would like to see resources going that way, but that's, I don't know how much that helps, but I want to hear what other people have to say.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. Yeah. This is a bit more beyond my technical. Thank you again, guys. That was really, all of you, really, really good, very amazing. But I'm wondering, I just offer this as a comment. I'm not an academic, I'm not an intellectual, but I'm just offering this as a critique. I was surprised by the definition of meaning. And I'm wondering if we're all already colonized by this objective industrial consciousness. Why are we looking at meaning as a noun? Why are we looking at just equitable society as a unit to be achieved? What if meaning is a process? What if meaning is in this intersubjective dialogue? Meaning is what I live by. It's not the answer to a riddle. And also, I'm sorry, I'm a bit emotional because for many, many reasons, having come out from what's considered in the West as an indigenous society, Indian middle class, being a woman, and knowing the drawbacks of that societies. Man, there are injustices throughout. If I'd stayed all my life in India, I would consider myself being oppressed by male patriarchy. I would not be standing here and trying to dialogue with you guys. So I'm looking, but I agree with you, Matt, that we should be looking at, there is a historical arc or dimension to it, an evolutionary process that's happening to society. I don't think we can posit what the future is, but we can just be open to let the future breathe through us, or something like that. Sorry. Yeah.
Anyway, I hope that made some sense, and I'd love to hear some comments.
Just on your comment about meaning, why do we conceive of it as a noun, something that we would find and possess, but that it's more of an ongoing process? That's kind of what my title is pointing to, from final knowledge to infinite learning. Yeah. And meaning is always discovered again, anew, with each encounter that we have. And it's not individual, nor is it simply communal either, because there can be communal social meanings that are oppressive, and then the search for meaning becomes, well, how do I break out of that? So it's this dialectical tension between inside and us together.
I really appreciate your comment, and it made me think of, I think all of us abridged what we, it made us, I think all of us probably abridged some of what we were hoping to say this morning. One of the things I really appreciate about where Barfield ends this essay that I was talking about a little bit is he ends with the thing that he calls the coming trauma of materialism, is what happens, supposing this affluent society, whatever you want to call it, what happens supposing it does crumble? And that's where the pedagogical role, Barfield thinks especially of the humanities, is so important. Because it's not, while I have some sympathies with Joshua's anarcho-Marxist notion that left to our own, we have desires and needs that we will collectively organize around. I'm sure you would probably hold to this too. I shouldn't speak for you, that's a terrible thing to do. But
it's not sufficient for politics, but it's...
Yeah, so Barfield's point is not that we need to imagine our way into the future, but that we need to prepare the conversations collectively and consciously, reflexively about our ends and our desires and the good, the true, and the beautiful, and so forth, that we need to prepare the space for them by engaging in those conversations now. Because what happens, suppose this structure collapses, it's just as easy to imagine an even more oppressive form of mobilization emerging. And that's where I think these sort of these exercises in these exercises in the collective imagination, not necessarily indexed to the future, but just exercises in the collective imagination of how we can be together powerfully and stably.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just to really quickly follow up on that.
This relates to the point I was trying to make about indigenous struggles, indigenous folks. I do not in any way mean to romanticize the past or romanticize or orientalize on indigenous societies. What I mean is that in those places where indigenous communities have been in struggle for their survival, this action you're talking about is not an exercise in imagination for them, it's an exercise in survival. So that's what I'm saying is very important to learn from. So I'm thinking about the fact that, when you say something like, well, what if this material order collapses, then what's next? We need to remember that this material order is a collapse for most people who have been living it for most of the time, outside of a very, very small window of folks like us who have tremendous resources. What about that, right? So that's kind of, and this is very much the edge of my own thought. So, I mean, I'm not saying don't engage the imagination and experimentation, but also, imagine that actual, say, black urban communities have managed to survive in the way that they have under the incredible conditions of degradation that they have, right? And let's find out what wisdom is in that, or what wisdom is in other kinds of survival like this. And again, this is a suggestion. It's not in opposition to what you're saying, but that was where my implication of indigeneity is coming from. And the other point to clarify really quickly is you're absolutely right. The way I was using the terms meaning and purpose were very pointed in my talk. I'm not trying to create, I'm not making a statement about the essence of meaningfulness or the essence of purpose in like a philosophical sense. I'm engaging in immanent critique with the fact that the way those signs are used in this context, which is the war of capital, is all about all the neoliberal ethics, leaning in, hacking your life, doing all the things you do to survive as a person working, in San Francisco. That's so you're right. I mean, I'm being very, very pointed in my use of that term because I agree with Matt completely, and I think I agree with you that meaning is a process that we can talk about this very differently. But I think it's very important to stay at that edge because human beings never just get to use words in an ideal or idealizing context. We're always in a situated historical situation in which those signs are indexed to different forms of life. I just want to make that clear. Yeah.
I am not an intellectual also. I am not part of this house, but I will take the risk in the conversation a little bit more about Mike's comment about...
A bit louder, please.
I will take the risk to comment about Mike's comment about the risks to the uncertainty. Because Matt says something that struck me about learning. You said learning will become something else. And it's an infinite task. So I am learning a lot about Christine Ford, taking the risk. To put all the resources out and to take the risk to produce some change. She doesn't know how it's coming after. She didn't know about the parents, whatever will happen, but she took the risk. She was in peace, a professor, well known, but she took the risk and put all the resources outside. So I think we can learn every day from these people and take the risk. And when I came to this country as a migrant, it's a risk every day. Yeah, it's a risk to be here. And being a woman is a double risk. With this color is another risk, and so on. So we cannot divide in minorities, or whatever is the word, between women, refugees, and that. It's a refugee, and plus a woman, and plus this, and plus this, plus this. So I think it's important to remember that we are a unity, and we can expand our consciousness. I think it's part of our task here to expand the hearts, as someone says. Expand our consciousness. I think is worth the risk. No?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
This
It's on.
It's on.
It's on.
Okay, this is more of a observation. Because when you started, Joshua, when you started and you had trouble saying that biblical phrase, that was helpful, because since that time there have been a couple more comments that seem to, just put out there, misunderstand your use of the word war. With Mike's comment of, I don't know what I'm signing up for, it could be John Lie's not going to make it, or I think even Matt, you said something about understanding. So I think for me, it's such a radical concept that you're stating that I think it's just going to, for me, it's just going to take time to assimilate. What you mean is, I think it's appropriate you're using the word struggle and the discomfort, because when the dichotomy of these words of war and peace just catapult you into opposition to even taking in what you're saying. So I just want to give you that feedback. Well, first of all, thank you, right, for letting us have a different look at all of those words and what they mean. But I think the feedback is that for me, I have to do some assimilation, but I want to thank you.
Well, so do I.
I know just to briefly say, Joshua, you were saying that consciousness is so important, but it's not enough. Material conditions being transformed so that, as Marx said, to each according to his need, from each according to his or her ability. Like both of these perspectives are so important, but given where we are right now and the amount of violence that would be required, at least in an interim period, in order to achieve an equality of material conditions, given the power structures in place, it seems to me to move forward, what we need is this consciousness of connection across differences so that we can mobilize together against the capitalist war machine without being broken up into these ever-vanishingly small differences and identities. And I love what you said, Joshua, about you are not an identity, you are your ancestors. Because when you go back far enough, we all share the same ancestors. So just a little plug for maybe a new kind of consciousness here to help us forward.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I think we're at the end of our panel, and it's time for lunch. So,
Thank you.